Thanks very much. A warm welcome to this UKIBC webinar in partnership with EY and HSBC. Today we'll be looking at the latest developments in the UK-India Free Trade Agreement. My name's Chris Hayes. I'm one of the directors at UKIBC. I have a background in trade and investment, so this topic is very close to my heart. This is one of the many webinars that UKIBC runs on a regular basis to keep our network up to date with key issues related to UK trade-India corridor. To keep up to date with all of our events and developments, feel free to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or you can sign up for our newsletter on our website, ukibc.com. Before we start, as usual, some housekeeping. You will all automatically be placed on mute, except for our speakers, of course. And as you will all know, it's now a requirement to say, sorry, you're on mute at least one time during an online meeting. So hopefully we'll be able to do that as well today. For any questions you have, feel free to place them into the chat box, and we'll have plenty of time to put these to our speakers towards the end of the session. You will also be glad to know that we are recording this session, which will then be placed on our website afterwards, and the link will be emailed out to all of you in case there are any sections that you would like to re-listen to, or if you would like to share that with your colleagues or your network. To set some context, on the 13th of January 2022, the Free Trade Agreement negotiations between the UK and India were launched with a two-day visit of the Secretary of State, Ms. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, to India. She met with her counterpart, Mr. Piyush Goyal, Indian Minister for Commerce and Industry. Since then, there's been rapid progress, with 4 rounds of negotiations taking place already, and the 5th one about to start. These sessions are covering 26 policy areas, and the negotiators are working hard towards the ambitious target set by both Prime Ministers of having an agreement in place by Diwali, which this year will be on the 24th of October. At UKIBC, we continue to act for our members to ensure that any free trade agreement will look at the reduction of tariffs, looking to remove non-tariff barriers related to the ease of doing business, works towards the better alignment of standards and simplification of customs procedures, and with a heavy weighting of services in both economies, an alignment on data protection and rules on IP practices. To help us understand the current position, I'm delighted to be accompanied by an excellent panel of speakers to give us their views and thoughts on the progress towards the FTA, and also how trade and investments is progressing as part of the comprehensive roadmap for doubling trade by 2030. I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Ayusha Chowdhury, India and Sri Lanka economist for HSBC. She joined HSBC in 2017. Prior to that, she worked at Goldman Sachs. Ayusha holds a Master's in Economics from the Delhi School of Economics. Ayusha, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Let me start with the outlook for India. India, like many other economies, has suffered 2 back-to-back shocks: the COVID-19 pandemic and the commodity price shock. India's current GDP is 6% above the pre-pandemic level. That said, it is still 6% below the pre-pandemic trend. Thankfully, the medium-term outlook looks better in comparison. Some new growth drivers have arisen in the pandemic period. Firstly, India is gaining global market share in high-skill exports. When we talk about high-skill exports, we refer to the high-skill manufacturing export, merchandise export, and the services exports. These began to improve during the period of 2017 to 2019, and we find that mobile phones, machinery, pharma, they have made clear improvements since then. Some part of this improvement can be attributed to the policy actions like production-linked subsidies, also known as the PLI scheme. This scheme offers incentives to boost domestic manufacturing and attract large investments. It offers incentives of 4 to 6% on incremental sales of goods manufactured in India to the eligible companies for a period of 5 years. Likewise, services exports too have been doing particularly well. And yet, India's share in global exports has not risen as much. And that is because our low-skilled exports are underperforming. We believe that India needs to diversify its export offerings in order to realize its true potential. The second important growth driver is the rise in digital startups, which is attracting substantial inflows in the economy. And it is likely to contribute more towards job creation, capex, and ultimately growth. Just to give you a background, India has world's largest fintech adoption rate of 87% as compared to the global average of 64%. Three of the world's largest public digital platforms are from India. Aadhaar, which is the largest unique digital identity platform, the Unified Payment System, also payment interface, also known as the UPI, which is the largest digital payment ecosystem, and CoWIN, the largest vaccination platform. And now, India is undertaking first of its kind initiative globally, which aims to democratize digital commerce, shifting it from the platform-centric model where the buyers and sellers have to come to the same platform or the application in order to transact to an open network. And this is expected to digitize the entire value chain, standardize operations, be it cataloging, inventory management, order fulfillment, everything. This will promote the inclusion of suppliers, ensure efficiency in logistics and value addition to the customers. Now add to this India's green transition ambitions. India's per capita emission is 1/3 of the global average, and yet India is the third largest emitter in the world. Keeping up with rapid growth while reducing emissions will be challenging. Thankfully, technological innovations are making this possible. The share of renewable energy in India's energy basket has risen, and it is stated to rise further under India's commitment for a net zero by 2070. And herein lies the opportunity, as a major part of India's capital stock in 2040 is yet to be built. India can potentially leapfrog into the new green technologies rather than being overburdened by refitting and converting the existing infrastructure into a green infrastructure. And herein also lies the opportunity to create jobs and attract investment in futuristic sectors like green hydrogen, EV, solar panels. Given these opportunities, the government remains strongly committed to capital expenditure as announced in the recent budget. This will enable India to build a strong physical economy with investments being channelized towards manufacturing and infrastructure, which further enables the digital economy to realize its potential. And this is where trade agreements come in play. A study by the Reserve Bank of India indicates that trade agreements often benefit the economy in the form of increased shipments of capital goods and industry supplies from their trading partners. And this indirectly contributes in the form of increasing the productive capacity of the country. Also, trade agreements help in integrating the economy with global value chains. Access to newer markets for the products where the country enjoys its competitive edge over the peer is just an added benefit. However, the trade agreements must not be limited to goods only. Service sector liberalization is equally important, and especially for a country like India, where services export constitute 40% of their total exports. Lastly, in order to make the most out of a trade agreement, both the countries have to constantly evolve to the changing trade patterns, work on improving their competitiveness, aim at making the procedures smooth and hassle-free so as to improve the ease of doing business and reduce compliance cost. Now, in order to put all of this in the current context, let me give you a quick overview of India-UK trade in goods and services, which was valued around £18 billion in 2020, with the balance of trade tipping in favor of India. India currently is UK's 20th largest export destination for goods and services, while United Kingdom is India's 6th largest market in terms of goods export. With regard to exports from India, it's usually concentrated in medicine, consumer goods like phones and clothes. While the medicine and phones become a part of India's high-skill export story, which is India's competitive advantage, an FTA arrangement with the United Kingdom will also help diversify its offering towards clothing and textile, which becomes a part of India's low-skilled exports. Also, for Indian businesses, UK represents a sizable market, and India-UK trade agreement could also offset to some extent the impact of the withdrawal from Pan-Asia RCEP deal. Likewise, the UK is also likely to benefit in multiple ways. The UK business currently faces average tariff of over 13% into India, including duties of about 150% for whiskey exports. This, along with high barriers to services and investment. Tackling tariff and non-tariff barriers will help provide UK businesses with certainty around the duty faced by them, around the trade policies of the government, and enable British exporters to tap into India's large and dynamic consumer market. With almost 1.4 billion people, India's population is bigger than the EU and US combined, making it the largest market the UK has committed to in negotiating a trade deal to date. The free trade agreement is likely to facilitate the target of doubling the bilateral trade between India and UK by 2030. But we should remember that by then, India would have become the third largest economy, hopefully, and a rapidly expanding middle class may just add and make India a more lucrative market for the British exporters. According to the World Data Lab, India's middle class is also estimated to cross around 1 billion by 2030, representing a very large proportion of India's population, which has a significant purchasing power. The free trade agreement is expected to facilitate this target of doubling the bilateral trade by 2030 and certainly has a lot to offer to both the countries. We hope that the positive momentum of negotiations continue and both the countries are able to arrive at a comprehensive, inclusive, and a seamless free trade agreement. Thank you, Chris. Handing it over back to you.
Thanks, Ayesha, and thanks for those great sort of setting the scene. I think one of the areas that really resonated with me there was the adoption of those green technologies in India. And we've already seen during the pandemic how when the UK and India works together, we can solve global challenges. And you can very much see that that's going to be the next case with those new energy technologies. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Next, I'm delighted to be joined by someone who has first-hand experience of the negotiations. Kate Thornley, Deputy Director, India Trade Negotiations for the Department of International Trade. Kate has led DIT's work on the UK-India trade policy relations over the last 2 years. Her work has included developing and agreeing the enhanced trade partnership, and she now oversees preparation for the negotiations of the free trade agreement. Kate joined DIT when it was a new department, and she's helped set up teams looking at protecting and improving UK's market access in Latin America, the Middle East, and South Asia. So very qualified speaker indeed. Kate, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and also thank you to Ayushi. That was a really inspiring and I think brilliant scene setter. Unfortunately, all the messages kind of align with the things that I was going to say, but also the reasons why I think this FTA is one of the most exciting, inspiring, but also challenging pieces of work to be looking at in our department at the moment. So I won't repeat some of the contextual things you've set out about why now is the time. Two huge economies, huge opportunities, huge interest. But I will talk a little bit about where the negotiation is up to, how we view it. And then I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion where we'll get some questions, comments, and I can do my best to let you know about how things are progressing within the negotiation. So I was just looking back at when I last did one of these webinars and my kind of work with the UKIBC over the last while. And it was exactly 1 year ago that our business and stakeholder consultation was live, when the UK, over the course of 3 months, went out to a huge range of stakeholders, civil society, business, public, business associations, to hear from them about what they thought about an FTA. And it was absolutely amazing to hear the breadth, depth, of interests that businesses, both from the UK and India, multinationals, have in this FTA. And then since we ran that consultation, indeed, we have been on a pretty intensive but very exciting negotiation journey with our Indian counterparts to do our best to deliver an FTA that works for both sides. I think, as Chris said, we've had 4 rounds. It's been a really interesting experience negotiating at the moment, both within the pandemic, so some of our negotiation has been entirely virtual, but also as we kind of move into a new world of doing things hybrid. So we've been lucky to have Indian delegations come to the UK for negotiations, and some of our delegation also travelling to Delhi to work on a hybrid basis. And I think, Chris, as you said, our approach to this negotiation is to start kind of really wide, really ambitious. And going back to the points that Ayushi made, both sides have got so many interests, so many opportunities. We are not short of things that we want to achieve in an FTA. So our approach to this has been to work across a really broad range of policy areas, and you referred to the 26 there. That includes everything from the really sort of, I guess, obvious areas that you've alluded to there, Ayushi, like goods and services, you know, talking about tariffs, investment, but also some quite new and innovative areas like innovation. So what do we do to support those new sectors, areas of growth, whether that's renewable energy, artificial intelligence, right through to things like gender and development. So what is the impact of a trade deal on consumers? So it has been a really rich and productive discussion. We're starting to get to crunch point. It's getting exciting. I will be travelling to Delhi in just over a week for round 5 of negotiations. And we're starting to talk about the tricky bits, you know, the bits about access, about how we bring down barriers to trade, how we talk about those tariffs that you alluded to there, Ayushi, how we support investors, how we make sure that services can flow. So negotiations are ongoing, they're getting ever more intense. And I think, as you said at the start there, Chris, our Prime Ministers have committed to concluding the majority of talks by Diwali, which isn't that far away. So we definitely have our work cut out for ourselves. But as I said, both sides have come to this negotiation with high ambition, with an acceptance that we will respect the sensitivities of both sides. A trade agreement has to work both ways, but that we want to get the best deal possible, and that we'll be kind of doing our best to make sure that we achieve that within the time that we have. I will stop there because I think it would actually be really, really interesting to hear from the panel and questions, and we only have 40 minutes left. But thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all of the kind of participants who have been with us on this journey, feeding in and supporting our approach to negotiations.
Thanks very much, Kate. Yeah, and just before we move to the panel, just a reminder, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then we'll have opportunities towards the end of the session to put that. So for the panel, once again, we're joined by Kate and Ayushi. As well as that, we're joined by Aganshaw Sen, Associate Partner, International Trade, Tax and Economic Policy at EY. Over the last 30 years, Aganshaw has gained vast experience in the international trade while working with the Government of India, the WTO Secretariat in Geneva as well. His areas of expertise include foreign trade policy, bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, WTO matters, trade remedies and FTA negotiations. And finally on our panel is Dr. Amrita Saha, Research Fellow and Lead on Trade and Developments at the Institute of Development Studies. Her ongoing research explores the political economy of trade protection. Amrita completed her doctorate in economics, for which she received the Exim Bank International Economic Research Annual Award in 2017. This panel session will be chaired by a man who needs no introduction at all, which is great for me, Richard Heald, Executive Chair of UKIBC. Richard, over to you.
Chris, thank you. And thank you for that, I think, a backhanded compliment. Anyway, look, it's lovely to have the panelists here. If I can start with a question, because it's something that I think is at the top of everyone's mind, and I'm going to start, if I may, with Aneshwar. It's not long to Diwali, 24th of October, and the negotiation rounds go every 5 weeks or so. What do you think is the likelihood of having a comprehensive free trade agreement, which is what both ministers talked about in January? And if that is not likely, all right, how do you see the process working, what being in, what not being in? I think you're on mute, actually.
So you get the first chance to make that statement.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard.
Normally it's me, I have to say.
It indeed is a pleasure for me to be here. And that's a very important question you asked to somebody, who spent 30 years, a lot of it on trade negotiations, and oftentimes, having spent years on trade negotiations and not having reached any conclusion whatsoever. So the timelines that we are seeing here, if I had been asked about a year and a half back before India started on the new round of FTA negotiations, I would have said it's highly unlikely we would come to any conclusion. But right now, I'm very happy to say, that it is not going to be so. We are certainly going to see some results, because there is a huge political commitment to, reaching some conclusion to the negotiation. Now, typically what has happened, as we have seen in the case of UAE and Australia, the two FTAs which India has recently finished with, they took place fairly quickly. They tied down what were the essentials, and they left a fairly clear pathway for things which could not be completed, to move ahead on. Again, just sharing my own experience, most of India's earlier FTAs, before the present set, they were focused primarily on goods trade, so the goods and goods related areas which are far more structured to negotiate, they were the subject matter of those agreements. And these are, with the entire ASEAN region, with Japan, Korea, so fairly comprehensive agreements. But the ones that we are looking now towards, and particularly the one with UK, which is a kind of a path-breaking kind of agreement for India, where we are looking to set off, trade concessions, that is goods trade concessions, with services, and bringing in a lot of, other areas which Kate talked about. For example, India hasn't talked about digital trade in any agreement earlier. These are complicated issues. There are ways, we'll have to move forward on. So when for me, I'm quite sure that there is going to be a fairly comprehensive result, which would either be, for example, in areas of trade, in areas of finance, something which is already finished, which would perhaps be increased a little, but there will be a very clear directions. How do we move forward in other areas, which would be new, which could, of course, include non-tariff barriers, the entire set, the technical barriers, the customs procedures, and entirely the new areas such as innovation, such as gender issues, in case those are coming in. So okay. I'm very bullish about it, that we will have a clear document by Diwali.
That's really encouraging. If I can actually not pose the same question to Kate, but ask a slightly different question, because as you said, you're coming towards the short strokes of the negotiation period. Can you just reinforce, if you like, how important it is that the principals, the prime ministers and the ministers involved actually have, and the negotiators, have a good rapport, because ultimately decisions, certainly at a political level, will get the thing over the line. Is that right, or how does it work?
That's absolutely right. And I think kind of having productive, respectful relationships right from, you know, our individual chapter leads, so the people who sit in a room for 8 hours talking about digital trade provisions, what can go in text, what can't, right through to the lawyers who scrub the text, and then right up to our you know, our ministers and our Prime Minister, who eventually have the say in, is this deal good enough? They have to be able to talk, cooperate throughout and find solutions. And it's actually been one of the very interesting things about the way we're negotiating now, because for a lot of our other trade agreements, it's been done entirely virtually. So kind of managing the relationships, that rapport, and the energy required to get through what can be really tough negotiations is tricky when you're doing it entirely over Teams. So we're actually very lucky now that we're able to do more of this face to face. And you know, you might come out of a really intense discussion talking about IP rights or whatever it is, and then breathe out over a coffee and, you know, talk a little bit more informally about, okay, so why does IP really matter? You know, what's behind this in terms of your business interests? And that really helps to get you through. But the political commitment to see this through the end stages will be really important. I think we are lucky that both in the Indian system and the UK system, we have strong relationships from a Prime Minister level down. Indeed, our Prime Minister visited India just back in April. And that was when this commitment to concluding talks by Diwali came about. So yes, Richard is absolutely right that it can't all just be done by individual negotiators. There will need to be a whole of system approach to this, which we are definitely gearing up to.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Amrita, if I may. And I might actually address, I was about to ask you about development, and I've just looked on the chat line that there is a question that could you expand a little bit about how the FTA would enhance gender issues and developmental issues, SDG, ESG, etc. If you could give a little bit of comment on around that.
Yeah. Thanks. Oops. Sorry. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I did note that question as well. So I think in terms of development outcomes, I think there are two aspects primarily that I see. India is an emerging superpower, but I think poverty and inequality remains fairly high, and any impact on these outcomes, you know, including effects on gender equality, I think would be driven by rather differential effects across very specific sectors, be it for consumers, for workers, for producers. And I think there are several examples here across goods and services, some of which have been mentioned by my fellow panelists. But just looking at an example, if we see textiles, which is a labor-intensive sector, which does employ quite a lot of women as well, had recent removal of some of the preferences on the generalized system of preferences. And there have been also adverse effects of the pandemic for this sector. So any sort of tariff concessions which the UK would grant, I think would be very welcome for India for these sort of wider development impacts. And I think the second aspect is that the potential, you know, agreement towards an FTA could also be viewed, I think, in the context of shifted priorities towards trade and development. And I strongly believe that a UK-India partnership could really complement the UK support to a wider development agenda, be it through South-South trade, technology and knowledge exchange, as well as wider development goals.
Okay, that's interesting. If we can turn to Ayushi, thank you very much for your overview. Just to echo what Kate said, I thought it was masterly. So congratulations. My question really is, how do you see the FTA leveraging, how do you see India leveraging the FTA? Bearing in mind, and what I'm really thinking about is a question I asked of Kate a year ago. I'm sorry about this, but is the difference between where issues are devolved to the regions, to the states? So you have, if you like, a matrix where you have the union government and you have the states. How do you see that sort of dynamic working on the Indian side within an FTA context?
See, with regard to the FTA, I think given India has a federal structure of the center making laws and the states making laws, I think an FTA can actually provide some sort of certainty, predictability, or rather transparency in terms of the policy actions and the policy taken by the government. So that clarity would be there. And I think it will also inculcate a little more competitive sort of a trade regime, because at the end of the day, the states would want to attract as much investment as possible, because that is one sure short way of increasing the state, like the growth rate of the states. But then India also has to bear in mind that there is a lot of state level divergence. So probably it will have to ensure that the investment which it is likely to attract, or the increased business opportunities which come by the way of the FTA, are distributed to the states in a way that it becomes a growing opportunity. So obviously, when committing itself for a free trade agreement, India has to be cognizant of its own interstate differences and ensure that it is planned in a way that it becomes an opportunity for all the states and a few are not left out.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to ask you a supplementary question, if I may, slightly technical, and then I'll ask Kate maybe to answer it as well, or at least shed some light on the subject, which is basically technical barriers to trade is something that is very important, and as you yourself indicated, the amount of investment that goes into both our countries from both India and the UK is quite immense. Technical barriers to trade, like rules of origin, are always problematical, and yet they actually act as a stimulus to domestic growth, often investment, etc. Can you just highlight how you see the direction of travel, or how you would like the direction of travel to go? And then I might ask Kate just to, if she can shed any light on her thoughts.
Sure. So, with regard to the rules around country of origin, I think this is sort of an issue even with India, because India also tends to follow the twin objectives of export promotion and at the same time import substitution. So I think in pursuing these two objectives, it sometimes become conflicting, because at the end of the day, every country wants to become a part of the global value chain. So in order to contribute to the value chain, you also have to import in order to be able to export. And I think from that perspective, I think Indian government has made some changes, and it has moved in the right direction. And I think there will be some more to come. But yes, very often these country of origin can actually act as an impediment to your export promotion goals, because a country can't produce everything domestically just to export. You have to import certain components in order to be able to value add and then export it out.
Yeah, and particularly relevant in a time when you're looking at dramatically changing supply chain structures. Kate, exactly. I don't know whether you can shed any light on that subject.
Yeah, really happy to. So I think it's one of the things with trade agreements. We'll talk a lot about tariffs, because it's quite easy to understand that when a tariff is 150% or 20% or whatever it might be, it is going to make it more challenging for that good to move over borders. But alongside tariffs, and I think, as Ayushi said, in an ever more connected world where supply chains are very, very rarely just one country, to have an effective kind of goods component in a trade agreement, you need to have rules of origin that account for how supply chains feed into different countries and how different goods are made. You need goods customs procedures, so like how are those goods going to move around the world, enter. You need good TBTs, the technical barriers to trade. So how do we label stuff? How do we put it on our shelves? So very much, I think, kind of when we talk about this being a comprehensive agreement, it's because we are looking at a range of issues that affect exporters, importers, investors and traders. And I think rules of origin is particularly pertinent to both economies, actually, and is, again, a sort of a very live bit of the negotiation at the moment.
We won't ask you to expand on that last comment, but if I can, there's one question that I've received from the floor, which actually has come up on a number of comments that you have made, which is around data and digital. I say that UKIBC and also NASCOM and Tech UK submitted a joint proposal into both governments in relation to the inclusion of a chapter on data and data protection and the enhancing and underpinning the digital growth that we're seeing in both our economies. But can I ask, I'm going to throw it open to the panelists to a certain extent and then ask Kate to comment on it. You know, what would you like to see, and how do you see such a chapter being crafted and including, particularly based on the fact that India is at this moment tabling its own and looking and debating its own domestic protection legislation? How do you see the two coming together? Because clearly you can't have a chicken before you have an egg. So can I will ask, I'll ask Agneshwar to try and field that one first.
Sure, these are the kind of things I was telling you, which in my opinion, certainly, this India-UK FTA is going to be a precursor for. And this is going to be a bigger issue, once India's negotiations with EU has just started, and it's going to be the elephant in the room really in that negotiation as well. These are the kind of things, Richard, where we got to have a very, how to put it, a very fixed agenda for action. Right now, taking commitments from India on digital privacy without its own law being in place is, how to put it, it really isn't workable. So, but this is where you got to set up working groups. You got to have, consultative and cooperative mechanisms, as a part of the agreement itself, with fixed timelines and aid and support to each other. More so India would require to share, UK's experience in this matter. I think that's what the chapter would look like at the end.
I don't know, Ayushi, whether you have any views on the shape of a chapter where you have underlying legislation being debated.
I would like to add it in the form of that when we talk about ensuring the protection of domestic industries, I think India needs to be careful, as Kate mentioned, of the sensitive sectors like the agriculture, the dairy sectors, etc. But when it comes to giving them opportunities to grow, I think in our bid to protect, we must not take away the opportunity to grow. I think the right amount of competition is equally important if you want these industries to actually grow and flourish.
Okay, Kate, is there anything you can add or shed light on? Or
So I guess negotiations are ongoing at the moment in that space, but it's a good thing that we are talking about digital. It's one of the things that from the consultation came through as a cross-cutting theme that mattered to so many companies, whether that be professional services, banks, as well as kind of tech companies where it's obvious they're going to care about digital things. It does make it challenging, I think, when legislation is live, and yeah, it's the point I made at the start that there are certain sensitivities where we have to respect that different things are going on in each government in each country, and we need to find a way of starting the discussion, ideally reaching an agreement, but if that's not possible, how do we continue that discussion? So that as our two kind of economies grow and develop and we get closer and closer, trade policy is supporting what businesses need to flourish. But yeah, digital is an ongoing discussion, and we'll have to see where that ends up.
Excellent. Okay, let me turn to Amrita, if I may. I hope this is a question that you can answer. We have a question that's been tabled to us about renewable energy. What would you like to see within the FTA framework and on renewable energy incentives or whatever?
Yep, thanks. Thanks, Richard. I think I'm going to try and answer that. I think a lot has been said about there being importance to business partnerships in the green technology space for renewables. But I also see that in addition to the economic gains, there's sort of opportunity here for contribution to jobs, support to SMEs in going along and exploring these opportunities in renewables. There are also some cross-cutting issues, which I think Kate and Ayushi have referenced. But I think in addition to sort of these cross-cutting issues around the regulation aspects being sort of, things to look into and plan for going forward, I think the renewable space is where there may be opportunities sort of which will go forward almost immediately. I think building on the strong complementarities that we've seen in the technology space. But I also see that the UK-India partnership is probably something that can set some sort of precedent here with the UK-India agreement also supporting sort of third countries to learn from sort of the new knowledge and technologies that would be generated in the renewable space. I hope I've answered your question there.
No, yeah. You have. Kate, I don't know whether you want to make any comments on renewables, which is a key part of what India is focusing on at the present moment, and the UK as well. You talked, I think, about hydrogen, or somebody talked about hydrogen, etc. But I don't know if you've got any observations you would like to make.
So it's definitely a really important area, and I'd say that even while the FTA negotiation is ongoing, lots of work is happening between the two countries to promote investment and kind of sharing of ideas in that space. But I think this issue raises a really interesting point, which is around when we talk about a trade agreement, we talk in quite technical chapters. And then what the way that the real world works normally is you think in sectors, so the agriculture sector, the renewable sector, the services sector. And as and when the agreement starts to conclude and we are ready to kind of talk about the detail to the world, we have to start talking about what that means for sectors as a whole. And thinking about the renewable sector, that could cut across any range of areas. It could be from an innovation chapter where it's about how the two countries will promote best practice, new technology. It could be a procurement chapter, how do you kind of access opportunities? It could even move into digital because, we know that investments and if companies are going to operate cross-border in that way, they need assurance of how information will flow. So I can't kind of commit in detail to how there won't be a sort of today, but I would like to think that there will be cross-cutting elements which will respond to some of the issues in that agenda because it's something that matters to both countries.
And Eshwa, if I can ask you probably the most difficult question on the service side, and as you might imagine, it's on the legal profession, and it has always been a topic of discussion for as long as I can remember between India and the UK. And how do you see there being progress in that area? Do you think in an ideal world India would allow UK lawyers and law firms to have corporate offices in India, and likewise in the UK, recognition of qualifications that are gained in India is something that the Indians would like? But how do you see that coming to the fore? Because in both professional services, legal and financial, there's always been discussion and debate.
It's not just discussion and debate, Richard. It's an unending discussion and debate on the same issue. I remember when we were first negotiating the WTO agreement on services, then there was a huge backlash to this whole, even to the question, what should we open and how much should we open. And unfortunately for the legal profession, a large number of lawyers are also members of parliament, who sit there. And for them, their interest in protecting their turf was very strong. Some changes have certainly happened, since then. Legal profession in India, there are now several very high quality law schools which have opened. The number of legal graduates that we are getting who are again going abroad, for further studies and coming back to India to work and practice. That kind of an integration is happening. Even where I work, we have a EY global law firm which is now operating in India. Of course, there are limitations on what services they can provide. But they are in, and slowly what is happening is, on a functional side, they are actually building bridges, with the true blue Indian law firms, so that progress is happening. I'm not sure, whether this was something which you can call, negotiating parlance, a low-hanging fruit which you can quickly go ahead and have an agreement on. But certainly progress would be made, and particularly, again, I come back to this thing about how important this UK-India FTA is. Because in this case, the way I have been looking at it, when we look at trade in goods, with UK with 40% of its tariffs, more than 40% of its tariffs already at zero, they will not be able to reciprocate, the kind of concessions that India may offer in terms of its own tariff reductions. You see, so that requires you to necessarily have a much more, how to put it, intensive and in-depth debate in services areas. And we know where the strengths of UK are, in terms of services. Legal profession is up there in that list. So I do expect, a very serious discussion to happen, and consequent to this, we will have steps taken in the right direction of opening up, I'm quite sure.
Okay, thank you. Kate, I'm not going to ask you specifically on legal services, but I am going to ask you about general questions around recognition of standards and qualifications, and is there a discussion that is taking place around those issues as well?
Yeah, I think the point on legal services is well made and well understood. On broader sort of recognition of standards and qualifications. Standards cuts across all sorts of things, products, and yes, there is a discussion going on within the negotiation about how both sides talk about standards, what that means for producers. The more alignment, the better. So yeah, that's definitely an ongoing part of the negotiation. And on recognition of professional qualifications, within our kind of services discussion, we talk about a huge range of services sectors, and everything from kind of architects through to lawyers, accountants, and how far each side can move to, I guess, accommodate, recognise and support those professionals. MRPQs is a kind of a thing are often done as a standalone agreement, but that definitely doesn't mean we're precluding them from our talks at the moment. And it's an area where I think there has been huge business support, business interest from both sides, actually, from British companies who want Indian nationals with qualifications to be able to come to the UK to work for them more seamlessly, and vice versa. I think the demand and appetite for greater flow of professionals is huge from both sides.
If I can ask Ayushi about a slightly different nuance of that question, which is the attitude of Indian business to the FTA, particularly perceiving the benefits of harmonization of standards and qualifications. There was a conference I was at yesterday evening where we were talking about the digital skills gap and how both UK and India need to have huge building up the kind of skills of the youngsters in order to meet the challenges of the changing technology space. Just, could you just give us a view as to how Indian business is looking at the FTA and these aspects of it?
See, obviously, like formalization and laying down rules regarding what is the standards or what are the bare minimum needs for a product to be able to qualify as an export product. That clarity obviously helps in a lot of business planning. And as I said, that level of clarity and transparency, I think that is something which the businesses would definitely want. Instead of having 10 rules to comply with, if they have one comprehensive list of rules which they have to comply with, I think that really improves their also, I mean, it helps making life easy for them as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap up the discussion. I'm not seeing any further questions coming through. So I've got 2 screens here. Well, I actually got 6 screens in front of me. So I'm going to hand back to Chris, who needs no introduction either, in order to do the summing up and the wrap up. So thank you, Chris. And thank you very much to the panelists for their answers to the questions, and particularly to Kate, who I felt was very open. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. And yeah, just to reiterate, thanks very much to all of our panel. I think at the start of this, we wanted to give everyone an update of where we were in the FTA and the direction of travel, and we've definitely achieved that. So a huge thank you to all of you, and of course a huge thank you to everybody who's been listening in to this webinar. As I mentioned, it is being recorded, so if you want to go back to any particular section, feel free to do that, and of course feel free to share with your network and your colleagues. And just to reiterate, if you want to keep up to date with all of the interesting activities that is happening in the UK-India trade corridor, if you follow us on Twitter at UKIBC, if you go on to LinkedIn, just search UK-India Business Council, you can follow us on there or sign up for our newsletters. Just shows how much of interest there is in the UK-India trade corridor. When I joined UKIBC 3 years ago, we had around 20,000 people following us, and we now have over 40,000, so a huge area of interest. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, and we will see you on our next webinar. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.